Hey, this is Lindsay. I just finished up at Glen Helen riding the 2021 Yamaha YZ250F. This year's model is very interesting because it's that typical mid-generation refresher that Yamaha does. For the past couple bikes, generation-wise, they'll basically do 4 years. They introduce a bike that is all new, heavily updated. The following year for year 2, they'll do a minor update or maybe even just a straight BNG, bold new graphics. And then year 3 of 4, they'll go through and throw a new frame on the bike. They'll update the motor pretty heavily, do the suspension settings with a pretty big overhaul. The bike may physically have the same look on plastics and stuff, but it's actually a very sizable update. And that's where we're at with the 21 YZ250F right now. It did gain a lot of the same changes as the 450 last year, a lot of things on the chassis side, and then a lot of its own updates on the motor side. Now, we won't go into too much detail on those exact changes. I can eat up a lot of this video doing that. I just really want to talk about what I thought of the changes. So if you want to hear the whole tech breakdown, link below, look around down there somewhere. It's more of an in-depth that only talks about the technical features. So kicking it off, first thing that comes to everybody's mind when they think of the YZ250F is power, whether you think of the production bike or the star bike out there just slaying guys in supercross and outdoors. The Yamaha is known for having this really strong 250F power plant. And yes, everybody's been stepping up their games the last couple years. There's a lot of bikes that are turning into screamers, they're making good power, a lot of top end power, but where the Yamaha is still unique is where it makes its power. People jump on it and they're always impressed because of that low to mid character it has, the recovery, the response. You guys are like, man, this thing I can just run it a gear higher, it's got so much response, etc., etc. And it was really interesting that Yamaha came into this bike and wanted to make changes to that power character. And interestingly enough, they're trying to move that power upstream. So that's actually the first place we're gonna start on, is what they did to the engine. Like I said, I've always really enjoyed the prior YZ250Fs for the past couple years because of that low end response. I feel like compared to almost any 250 in the class, if I'm on the Cowie or the Honda or the KTM, if I'm hitting a corner in second, I can pretty often I can hit that same corner in third on the 250 Yamaha, and that's what makes it really interesting. You can run it a gear longer, you're at a lower RPM where the suspension works better, you're not shifting it as often. It just makes you be able to put a lot of time and effort into your line selection, thinking about where you're at on the track when you're not just having to row through the gears. And also being able to use that low end power to pull the bike out of weird situations when you bury it too much into a berm or things like that. New bike definitely shares some of those characteristics, but I was actually really surprised from my first couple laps on it is they've definitely done a lot of changes to move that power up into mid-top, and right off the bat I do gotta say, I did notice a little bit loss of bottom. But at first I was trying to gather, okay, how much of a trade-off did we make here? Instantly, I was shifting the bike a little bit more. I was doing a lot more 2, 3, 4 sections than I would third and fourth gear. Yeah, it still has a little bit more bottom end pickup, a little bit more response or recovery RPM feel than a lot of the 250 in the class. Don't get me wrong when I say I feel like there is a loss of bottom end. It's not drastic, not to the point that I feel like all of a sudden there's another bike out there that's better low to mid. The Yamaha still has them covered, but enough of a loss. I'm noticing a different amount of shift points, and just the biggest thing is that initial snap. It's a bit of a snap and engine inertia that I notice a difference in. The bike doesn't have quite as much of a tractor feel, which was actually interesting because while it's been really fun having that power on the old bike, I actually noticed the new bike handles better. A lot easier to keep it leaned over in a corner, a lot easier to charge and attack on because it doesn't have that same amount of inertia and pickup feel that would almost stand up the old bike at times. So the old bike, you would just kind of power out and rear steer out of stuff because it would lift up really early. The new bike actually carves, stays down a lot easier to, from middle corner on, just carry that momentum and carry that lean angle and stay in the line you wanted to. So that part I was actually really happy with. Basically, the more I rode the bike, it's become obvious that, Yamaha has looked at what their competitors are doing. Like, hey, we need a more rounded package, because that's what everybody says about this engine every year. Man, yeah, that low to mid's great, but that KTM or that, it just outpulls it up top. The new Cowie motor does that. The Honda's all top end basically, but those bikes just all really scream, where the Yamaha tends to get a little flat up top. It has a little bit of heavy of inertia feel. So by doing this, they've positioned it a little more into that broad power range that the rest of the manufacturers have. So my initial comment on the motor is for the vet guy who like the Yamaha as their little mini 450 toy. They might be a slight bit disappointed, to be honest, because that pickup just isn't quite the same. That character has changed a little bit. But in the same breath, it's still better low to mid than pretty much any other bike in the class. It's got more top end to match, it's more broad. The more aggressive 250 kid, the youth rider, the amateur that is riding the bike for what it's worth, riding it pretty much a little more like the coming off the 125s, are really gonna enjoy these engine changes overall. Now, when we talk about that top end, how big of a gain are we saying? Straight out of the box, I felt a little more of an even trade-off. What I lost on bottom, I feel like we gained a little bit mid to top, maybe a little more than the loss. But I definitely noticed myself rolling through the gears a lot. Particularly, I felt like third gear in base off the showroom floor trim was, I don't want to say the word useless, but going by pretty quickly. I'd come out of a rut in second, grab third, and I felt like within 2 seconds I was instantly going to fourth gear. So I was going 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, which is fine on big open sections. It gets up into fourth gear. Fourth gear is really broad, really usable, but it's in those tight little sections where you come out and you've only got a little bit of runway to the next corner, where I felt like, third's nosing over too quick. Is it worth going to fourth? Came in, mentioned the Yamaha guys. I tried the additional map that comes on the bike, the second map, which they call exciting map. Yeah, it picks up more. It's a little more freer revving even than the stock one is, but that top end was still a little shuts off a little quick for me. Went a little flat too quickly. Mentioned the guys, they threw a different map in. I'll actually have a picture of that down below in the comments section. That was a big improvement for me. Really just stretched out the top end, made it to the point that third was usable in those tight sections without going to fourth, and really made it feel like instead of going 2, 3, 4s, 2, 3, 4, just a nice broad usable amount. And each gear had a home in place with that mapping change. So nothing too drastic. The stock tuner tool that Yamaha has in the app is super useful. You can do some really cool changes, but I mean, it's not what an aftermarket ECU is. The changes we're talking about are pretty minor on their little graph, and yet it was a noticeable enough difference. I came back to the Yamaha, I was like, yeah, okay, that bottom end we lost, that little bit of snap, with now the way that it handles in the corner, with that mapping change, that mid to top we have, I'm super happy. So from my position, with that map change, I do like the engine overall better than the 20, but like I said, there are gonna be some guys that are gonna jump on it and they actually might prefer that 20 engine package just a little bit. Now the engine side is, what's unique on the updates here. The suspension and particularly the frame side is a lot of changes that they've adopted from last year's 450 that were really successful. The frame itself, and then the direction with the suspension is very similar. I've run into, as we've said for years, man, the Yamaha is great when it's rough. Everybody knows that out of the box, they have very solid suspension settings. They're very well rounded. They work good for vets, beginners, high level intermediates, pros. It's easy to adjust. It's very comfortable. Now the downside where I think a lot of guys get into the Yamaha being a weird bike to push on is because the frame is so comfortable and the suspension is so comfortable, the bikes tend to wallow a little bit. You really charge them into corners, you feel it down low in the stroke, you feel the balance of the bike shifting a lot. So it's a little bit hard to really want to push the Yamahas in stock trim because they just tend to wallow around and move so much. So with these chassis updates, the new engine mounts, the spar changes, the cradle changes, they've really tried to get the bike a lot more precise, but without giving up that comfort they had before. And the biggest place they've done is suspension settings are just a lot more progressive. You feel a lot more speed sensitivity in the fork and shock. And the biggest thing is the bike balance is there a lot more. Out of the box, I ran the bike at 102, 103 sag. I believe 103 is where we ended up. Fork setting, I was going back and forth between 2 and 3 clicks stiffer just for initial weight transfer, and then a little bit quicker on the rebound for the hills at Glen Helen. I changed the shock back and forth a little bit, but I actually ended up on stock shock position. Just for what we were riding there is winter at Glen Helen is finally staying a little wet. Some good ruts, pretty rough on the hills. Yeah, it's not East Coast deep, but enough that I was actually really satisfied because the balance was there. Once again, the Yamaha has so much comfort in the chassis. I didn't feel like I was having to change anything on the suspension. Once I stiffened up that fork and found that balance, I was super happy. The bike definitely for me is the best YZ250F there's been. For somebody that's probably looking for that perfect middle ground. You still have the comfort, you have more comfort than your 250 chassis out there, but it's got a lot of that precision and response that brings it more in line with the Honda, the Cowie towards KTM on just being able to throw it around, see that line to the inside and you want to dive for it. The Yamaha's never been known for being that nimble, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's like a lot of guys claim the Suzuki, like, oh, it's just gonna dive straight to the inside, but it's definitely a big improvement. And similar to their engine character change, it just broadens out the usage of the bike. It speaks to a wider range of riders to throw their legs over it. Now, one point of contention for me is still a little bit of the ergonomics on the bike. They've definitely, of course, worked hard to get a flatter profile. They're still, where it goes up into the airbox, you have quite a bit of gain of height in that seat going in the airbox. It's a bike that's a little harder for me to stay forward on sometimes. But then they've also, in this past year, they did it to the 450, I think last year, the year before, and then 250 this year, where the bars are now in the forward hold position on the clamp stock, which does help you stay forward, of course, but it also just feels a little odd to me because they've got a really short foot peg to seat height. So your legs are up really close to you. You feel like your arms are way up here. You're kind of in this jockey position, which I think, depending on your body build, might be a good thing. They definitely seem to have test riders that like it. I spent 2 sessions on it. I had to revert. I had to go bars back to the back position just because I felt like I was so stuck over the front of the bike the whole time. If you really struggle with keeping your position forward, it's great. For me, I've got short little T-Rex arms. I don't need it. I'm just stuck on the front of the bike the whole time. I felt like I couldn't get off the back. I felt like I couldn't plant down on my heels and drive the rear end in places, so I had to reset that bar position back. Once I was there, everything felt a little more neutral, but still that peg to seat height's really tight. It's good because when you're going through ruts and you've got both your feet on the pegs, or you're standing through sections, you feel like you have more clearance. You don't feel your feet or the sides of your toes, your heels catching as much on the ground, but also at times it's a little bit more of a cramped feel for me overall. And it's definitely some point, as I've talked to a lot of guys that are used to Yamahas are good with it, guys that jump off our bikes and get on them. Sometimes I think that's part of where some of the ergo questions come into play, where guys jump on the Yamaha sometimes and just don't feel perfectly at home. It's still something that's unique to that bike. The shroud shape, of course, with the airbox, albeit it's not wide like it used to be. When you measure, it's actually pretty skinny. It's just the way the shrouds wrap over the top. It just gives the Yamaha a little bit more of a unique profile and character that's different to get used to. So the positives: Yamaha is a great tuner app. You can really tweak and move around the power. When you have a 250 with this much power, it's easy to reposition it a little bit where you would like it. Yeah, the engine as an overall whole has changed in character. It's a lot more free revving, just a lot more of a freer, quicker picking up engine. Really good mid to top, a little bit of bottom loss, but for the most part, those gains have been those losses have been offsetted by bigger gains. Chassis, a lot more well-rounded than it used to be. It's not the most nimble in the class still, but definitely gained on turn-in response, and overall just handling characteristics are better while still maintaining a lot of that Yamaha comfort. Suspension, stiffer settings, a lot more hold up, way better bike balance. Maybe for some of your more slower riders, your vet riders, there might be a little bit loss of comfort from the suspension side, but I think they've done an overall good job of balancing that out with what they gained. And overall, still the ergos are the only point on the bike that I think are, a contention for some people depending on where they like their setup. But I think the bright side with the Yamaha is, once again, they've widened out the characteristics of the bike. There's a lot you can tweak on between the mapping control and all the stuff with the cockpit and the ergos. So a lot of guys should be able to jump on this bike and find something they like. And that's why this bike has done so good in shootouts year after year. Is it the perfect 250F? Not for every person, but it seems to be the bike that most guys can jump on and find something very comfortable, very quick. It's ultimately one of the best parts about buying a new dirt bike. If you get it and your first outing or two on it, you can find something that makes you happy. That's why the Yamaha continues to be a great buy every year.